You can use the horizontal line test to determine if the inverse of a graph is a function. So let's consider this graph right here. Here's what the horizontal line test says. Draw a bunch of horizontal lines through the graph, and if any of these horizontal lines cross the graph at more than one point, then the inverse of this graph is not a function. So for example, for this first horizontal line, we can see it crosses the graph right here, and it crosses right here. Similarly, for this line, it crosses the graph here, and it crosses here. So for each of these horizontal lines, we can see it's crossing the graph more than once. And that just means that the inverse of this graph is not a function. Now, in this particular example, this graph is y equals x squared. That's the equation of this graph. If we were to find the inverse of this equation right here, the way we do that is we flip the x and the y, and we solve for y. So we'd say x is equal to y squared, so we flip the x and the y. To solve for y, we would take the square root of each side. Now when we take the square root of a number, the solution is a plus and a minus, so we get plus or minus the square root of x is equal to y. Or another way to write that is y is equal to plus or minus the square root of x. Now if we were to graph this function, it would look something like this, where it opens up to the right like this. Now, if you just wanted to know if this particular graph represented a function, you could instead use the vertical line test, which says draw a bunch of vertical lines through the graph, and if any vertical line crosses the graph more than once, it's not a function. So we can see this vertical line crosses right here, and this vertical line crosses right here. So each of these vertical lines is crossing at more than one point, which means this particular graph is not a function. Now, the horizontal line test was basically just a shortcut for all this. It says you don't need to go and find the inverse and then graph the inverse and then perform the vertical line test. You can just use the horizontal line test to just determine if the inverse of a graph is a function or not. So it's just a faster way to do so. All right, let's try one more example. Let's say we have this graph and we want to know if the inverse of this graph is a function. Well, once again, we can use the horizontal line test where we draw a bunch of horizontal lines through the graph, and let's just see, does it cross the graph at more than one spot? So for this first horizontal line, it crosses the graph right here, and that's the only spot it crosses the graph. Similarly, the next horizontal line crosses right here, it only crosses once. This horizontal line only crosses the graph once. This one crosses once. So each of these horizontal lines is only crossing the graph one time. So that means the inverse of this graph must be a function. Now, this particular graph represents the equation y equals x cubed. So if we were to find the inverse of this function, remember we just switch the x's and the y's, so we say x is equal to y cubed, and then we solve for y. So to solve for y, we would take the cube root of each side, so we would get y is equal to the cube root of x. Or if we wanted to write it like y is equal to the cube root of x. If we were to graph this equation, here's what it would look like. It would have this type of pattern right here. And if we were to go and use the vertical line test to check if this graph was a function, so if we draw a bunch of vertical lines like this, we would find that each of these vertical lines is only crossing the graph at one point, which means that this graph does represent a function. But as we mentioned earlier, the horizontal line test is just a shorter way of doing that because we already know that the inverse of this original graph must be a function because it passed the horizontal line test. So those were just two different examples of how to use the horizontal line test to check if the inverse of a graph is a function.